Okay. I'm thinking we can get one last game in and then call it a night. So let's get one last speedrun game in, 10 plus 5. And we're playing a 1600, which is fine by me. Let's go. We're gonna get 40 points for a win. Our rating gain is gonna slow up though. Okay, so we already know what we're playing against the Sicilian. I recommend this to every beginner player, either the Grand Prix attack or the C3 Sicilian. It's been a while since we played the Alapin. It really has. So let's go back to the Alapin and see how it works against the 1600. Why am I so obsessed with the Alapin? Because again, it's a very positionally healthy opening. You are immediately contesting the center, and when you play through the center, you automatically get basically points for playing good fundamentals. E6, okay, so now D4. Yeah, so E6 is a very common response, and D5. So here we have a choice. We can go E5 and transpose the game into an advanced French. If you play the French, or rather, if you play the advanced, this makes a lot of sense because our opponent might not be intentionally getting the game into a French. But for the purposes of this game, we're going to go for the more traditional Alapin way of playing, which is to take on D5 with the pawn, giving black the choice of what to recapture with. Okay, pawn takes. Now, which type of structure is this heading toward? Those of you who've watched my speedrun games and my stream know that this is heading toward what's called an IQP structure, isolated queen's pawn. Because at some point, we're going to probably take on C5, and black is going to be left with an isolated pawn on D5. Oh, is there any rush to take on C5? Do we need to do that now? Oh, excuse me, we do not. And for the time being, we can develop our pieces, and oftentimes the rule of thumb in such positions is to wait for black to develop the dark squared bishop and only then to take on C5 in order to make black lose a tempo. So let's begin by playing knight F3, then we can play bishop B5 check and castle, and only when the bishop from F8 moves, then we're going to take on C5. Okay, so I like the idea of giving a check and developing with tempo. In general, trades are going to be in favor of the side that plays against the IQP. Because, you know, the more pieces are traded, the weaker the pawn becomes. Yeah, so I'll talk about B6 after the game. B6 is not scary. I mean, yes, he's going to avoid the IQP structure, but it's going to come at the cost of development. Okay, and I'll talk about C4 as well. So let's trade. And then let's castle. This is the main line, what he's going for. So white's going to be slightly better. Nothing major, but it's going to give us a chance to play, to show some fundamentals. Okay, bishop E7. Now, the reason black has played this very well is because he's positioned his knight so that on d takes C5, he can take with the knight. But we still want to take. We still want to get the IQP structure, even though it means we haven't won a tempo. Knight E5, I don't really know why knight E5 is so impressive. Knight E5, black can just castle. All right, that's nothing crazy there. So there's a point that I repeat a lot. Assuming he takes on C5, I don't know what he's thinking about. Bishop C5 allows a rook E1 check, which black certainly does not want to allow. Yeah, I know a lot of people are wondering about B6. That's something I'm going to talk about after the game. Now, assuming that black plays knight takes C5, perhaps you can think about where we want this bishop to be developed. Of the three feasible squares, E3, F4, and G5, all of which, by the way, are completely reasonable ways to develop the bishop. Wow, he does take with the bishop on C5. Okay. I really don't understand this move. Now, there's one important detail. Rook E1 check. I have a feeling that he's cooked up the move knight E4 in response. Rook E1 check, knight E4. What does white have in that position? Without this move, his idea would be very reasonable. Not bishop G5. No, this is after rook E1 check, knight E4. After rook E1 check, knight E4. We can play queen takes D5. Okay, so let's make the move on the board. He's also disconnected. Rook e1 check. Now, if knight e4, black loses contact with the d5 pawn, we play queen takes d5. Now, bear with me here. Black can play bishop takes f2 check, right? Pinned pieces protect, so we can't take that bishop. Bishop takes f2 looks very strong. So, knight e4, queen takes d5, bishop takes f2 check. But keep calculating. We move our king aside to f1. Black takes the rook with the bishop, and this is going to happen. And then what do we do in that position? It's going to be 2 pieces for a rook. Yeah, it's going to be 2 pieces for a rook. And that's, of course, very good for us. And this is exactly what happened. Bishop takes e1, queen takes e4, check. He can play queen e7, it doesn't matter. Then we're going to trade queens and then pick up the bishop, and we're going to have 2 pieces for a rook. Not crazy hard to calculate, right? Take the queen. And then, of course, we want to take the bishop with the king, while our knight is perfectly well positioned on f3. And now we have 2 pieces for a rook. We have a material advantage, and we should be able to convert it. What's up, man? We should be able to convert it pretty handily. Okay. So, first order of business. Well, there's actually 2 things we need to be careful about. The first is we have a couple of weak squares in our position. We have a hole on d3 that the knight can try to get to. The e-file is currently under black's control, so not everything is hunky-dory here. We have to be cautious. What I like is the idea of starting with either king f2, but what I like even more is preventing black from going knight c5 by playing bishop e3. Now, am I not worried about stepping into the pin? Actually, no, I'm not. Because if the king moves away, then we can respond with king f2, getting out of the pin and defending the bishop. Very concrete. Right? Just calculate. And these types of concrete calculations always supersede your general worry. Like, oh, I'm walking into a pin. But it's a completely temporary pin. We're going to play king f2 on the next move. So our plan of action, king f2, knight d to d2, and then maybe perhaps we can get our knight to the center with knight c4. We can get our rook into the game. Once we get all of our pieces into the game, black is going to have a very hard time holding things together. There is a nice move here, knight f6, which would force us to be accurate, but I'm not afraid of it. Okay, knight e5. As I always say, when you've got, how do you evaluate 2 pieces for a rook? Generally speaking, there's one very important rule of thumb, let's trade, which is that the presence of an additional pair of rooks favors the side with the 2 pieces. So if you took the a1 and a8 rooks off the board, white would still be much better, but it would be a little bit less clear-cut. The presence of the rooks allows us to keep the minor pieces anchored, right? We don't have to worry about the minor pieces getting tangled up. We can use our rook to defend against side-to-side rook moves. Okay, so how should we continue? Thank you, Jacqueline, for the prime. Well, let's begin by developing our knight. I think that's a pretty reasonable approach. Knight d2. And then our bishop is attacked. We got to be careful. We cannot move it because of rook e2. Knight c4 would allow rook e4 and get into unpleasantness. So we bring our rook into the game with rook e1. Good stuff. And then we're ready to play knight f3 and chase the rook away from e5. Yeah, we could have gotten the knight to d4 in a variety of ways, but it seems as good as any. f5, okay, great. Threatening f4, but the move knight f3 comes with tempo, so we don't have to worry about f4. No, knight a3 was also fine. I don't think it really matters. Okay, rook b5. This is an instructive moment. I think a lot of people would go b3 automatically, but I made this point in the last game, the same thing about Luft, right? When you're pushing your pawns, and you're pushing your pawns for a reason, you want to see the bigger picture, right? b3 is not the only way to defend the b-pawn. And as somebody mentioned, I really like the idea of going b4 to create an anchor point for the bishop on c5. Why not knight, you mean knight d4? Because knight d4 would blunder, oh, my keyboard died, one sec. Knight d4 would blunder the pawn on b2. Rook b6. Ooh, this gets my tactical senses bubbling because the rook is almost trapped, although I don't see a way to physically trap it. If our pawn was on a3, we'd be able to go c4 here. Okay, so I have a clever move in mind, folks. a4 would trap the rook if it weren't for rook d5, and immediately you should come up with a move. Immediately you should come up with a move. Now, some of you might think, okay, let's go c4 then. But I already talked about it. c4 blunders the b pawn, so we go rook d1. We repurpose our rook. We guard the d5 square. Now we're threatening a4, and I don't think he has a defense against it. Simple enough, right? Oh yeah, I guess black has to play f4 and give up a pawn, but open up the rook's pathway. I mean, that's kind of desperation. Oh, I guess my webcam is stuck. Okay, we're good. Okay, kudos to our opponent. He sees it, but now we have another pawn to the good. And we're ready to infiltrate with rook d7 on top of everything else. Rook f5. Okay, we can go bishop g3, we can go bishop e3. It truly does not matter. Bishop g3, maybe g5. Yeah, we could go with bishop. I don't like bishop d6 though, because that puts the bishop in the way of the rook. Just because the move is a check, right? You shouldn't necessarily be inclined to play it. You know what I like here? I like the move pawn g3. I like the move g3 because it keeps the bishop solidified. We're defending against g5, which is never going to be a problem. If he goes h6, we go h4. That's the typical kind of sequence, right? And I know it's a little scary to have your pieces on the same file like this, but if you think concretely, black's only way to kick them away is g5. And if g5 is taken care of, then there's no problems. Okay, now let's get down to business. We have a pawn majority on the queen side. You know what that means? That means we should... The fastest way to win here is to create a passed pawn and promote it. How should we do that? Well, not a4, right? a4 is not the good way to create a passed pawn, because even if we play a5, black just ignores us. What we want to do is go c4, and here black cannot stop c5. So an easy way to determine which pawn to push, right, is to just compare where your extra pawn actually is located. Right? It's not on the a file, it's not on the b file, it's the c pawn. That's the pawn you want to push. What's the move now? Using a little bit of tactics, let's not automatically assume that this pawn has to be defended. If you think a little bit tactically, you can see the move c5 is possible here. After black takes, we'll have bishop d6 check with a fork. Classic stuff that happens when your bishop is so active. This is simple but powerful. So a lot of you are probably wondering why I haven't put the rook behind the pawn, because I don't need to. My minor pieces are perfectly capable of supervising this pawn. King g8 is a nice move though. So there's a tempting move knight e5 in this position, which I don't like, because after the rook moves, he's going to be threatening g5. Well, c6, no. c6, rook takes c6. And then if knight e5, he has got rook c2 check. So now is a perfect time to protect this pawn with a rook. Where do we want to do it from? Now, normally, I agree, the rule is rook behind pawns. Normally, that's true. In this particular instance, though, I don't think that's strictly necessary. I don't want to give away the d-file. I'm really happy with our d-file control. Let's go rook d5. Hopefully, the logic makes sense, right? I feel like controlling the d-file here is even more important than putting the rook behind the pawn. There's no rush to push the pawn here. We can gather our pieces. We can play the move h4, which I would really like to do in order to permanently prevent g5 so that our knight could move without having to worry about it. Thank you, T-Market, for the prime. Another thing we could do is go knight to d4 so that the rook defends the g5 square. And so g5 is once again not a problem. Thank you, T-Market. Yeah, I like knight d4 followed by c6. Okay, takes, we take with the pawn, of course. And I would imagine he's going to go rook b7. Yeah, he's defending well, but we're grinding him down. Okay, so there comes a point in the conversion of these types of endgames where you have to be ready to give away a couple of pawns at times in order to promote your passer. And that moment is going to arrive in the event of rook b7. There we go. I'm thinking about a tactical move. What am I thinking of? What move am I thinking about here? And you should always check in such situations whether or not you can't push the pawn. Because when you've got minors on active squares, using forks and pins, you're frequently going to be able to justify pushing the pawn. So let's consider c6 for a second. Okay, well, that looks like it blunders the pawn. But look a little bit further. c6, rook takes c6. What do we have? We've got rook d8 check, driving the king out, and then knight e5, and we pick up the rook. So we can safely go c6 here. Now, of course, black can also give us a check on b2 and then take the pawn on a2. But our pawn is so close to c7, we do not give a rat's ass about the pawn on a2. Because our pawn is essentially home free. And it's always a judgment call, right? You don't want to start giving away. So what often happens is that you see a way to promote your pawn and you start pushing it and you start giving away your other pawns. What you have to be careful about is a situation where your opponent takes all of your pawns, then gives away the rook for the passer. And then at the end, you get a situation where you've got like knight against 4 pawns. In this case, I have 2 minor pieces. So it's not like black is going to be able to give away his rook for one of them. c7 is coming. So black can either take the pawn on a2 or go rook c2, in which case we play c7 and black's going to have to give the rook up for the pawn, and that's just going to leave us with a full extra knight. Ah, come on, man. Yvonne, thank you for vegan hypers. Why did I go king e3? I don't like going king g1 in these situations, in any of these situations, because it locks the king on the first rank and it creates potential for ladder mate, and I don't want that. Okay, c7, obviously. Here we can play very quickly, and the game is over. King f7, and rook d8. Perhaps not the most accurate. Perhaps we could have finessed this a little bit and gone rook d7 check, and then gotten the knight around. I don't care. We know that we can win a full piece. Let's go for it. He says GG. GG. Oh, I'm not able to send chat messages because I don't have like a full account for the speedrun. And resignation. Okay. Great stuff. Let's have a quick look-see and then we'll end for today. So yeah. So we had an Alapin, we traded. Everything was totally fine and totally natural up until DC. Bishop takes c5 was just bad. The knight takes c5. I want to come back to the point about IQPs. The point I've drilled into your head is that when you're facing an isolated queen pawn, the crucial thing is to have as vast control of the square in front of the pawn as possible. You want to control the square in front of it, blockade it. And so the move knight d4 comes to mind, but you don't have to rush to put a knight on d4. You're already controlling the square. And you can control it even further by playing bishop e3. And then getting the knight out to b2, out to d2. So this is the setup I would adopt here. And then when the time is right, you can put a bishop on d4 or a knight on d4. White is slightly better. Okay, bishop c5, of course we give a check. Now if he had gone back to e7 with the bishop, let's see if people can apply the lesson we learned from one of the first speedrun games. What would you do here with white? Can you propose a nasty little move that tries to get black to pay for losing so many moves? Very good, queen e2. Queen e2, stopping black from castling. And if black plays knight e4, we can perhaps try to undermine the knight with c4 or trade it with knight b to d2. Black could end up losing a pawn here. Knight e4, queen takes d5, and the game is already essentially over. Bishop f2, king f1. How does it stop castling? Because if black castles, I guess it doesn't physically stop castling, but this would mean black loses a piece. Now, in such situations, you have to be careful about a move like rook e8. I know people know what I'm talking about. Sometimes this is actually a trap, but not in this case. Here you just take the queen. And not only is the rook on e8 pinned, But even if it wasn't, the knight on f3 is protecting your own rook. But you got to be a little bit careful about that trap. Okay. So knight e4, queen takes d5, bishop f2, king f1. Oh, what's up, Kirker? Yeah, so we trade queens, we take e1. Now it's a technically winning position. Okay, so you want to go to move 20. Oh, yeah, so the question is, why did we go knight f3 and not knight c4? Knight c4 is totally fine. But I don't know why I went knight f3. It's just that I was aiming for d4. I thought this was like the geometrical center of the board. Of course, knight c4 is also fine. I also feel like the knight is sort of slowing down the progress of our own pawns. It really doesn't matter. Both of those moves would have been totally acceptable. Oh, and finally, the knight would anchor the rook on e1. Oh, yeah. So I forgot to talk about. A lot of people were worried about black going b6. So, of course, the move b6 avoids the IQP structure, but white's position is also good just because we've got great development. So, for instance, we could go rook e1 check, bishop e7. We could still go queen e2 and bother black, stop him from castling. Or we could go b6, rook e1 check, bishop e7, and, for example, knight e5, which some people suggested. And if black castles, then there's knight c6, and guess what? We're making black pay for the move b6. The move b6 is not all good because it weakens a lot of these light squares. And at some point later, you could also go queen a4 and try to infiltrate them. So don't worry too much about your opponent not allowing you to get into the IQP. Your position is solid apart from that too, if that makes sense. Okay, so once we got this endgame, I think everything was very straightforward. Rook d1 was important, stopping the rook from escaping and forcing black to give up a pawn. Other than that, I think it was pretty simple stuff. Okay, guys. I think this is a great spot to end. I know this was a shorter stream. I will have a long stream tomorrow. I'll try to find time for 5 or 6 hour stream. I don't have too much on my docket tomorrow. But for today, I'm going to go take the Friday night off. I hope you guys do as well. Hope you have a great start to the weekend. I hope you enjoyed the speedrun, a little extended speedrun today. Thank you, everybody, for the excellent support. You have plenty more entertainment to look forward to. Thanks, guys, for hanging out. Have a great start to the week, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.